Hauntings, ghosts, entities, there are those that believe they exist, and there are many who don't. But we can't deny that there are things in life that happen that seem simply unexplainable. Such was the case with the family of 1800s farmer John Bell, whose family was put through a litany of terrifying moments while they claimed to be haunted by a local witch. What happened on the Bell family farm? Was there really a malevolent spirit attacking the family? Or did they simply live through a slew of misfortunes that made it seem as though they were haunted? This is a brief history of the Bell Witch haunting. As always, this episode of A Brief History may contain graphic content and is not suitable for all audiences. Viewer discretion is advised. In addition, the legend of the Bell Witch is just that, a legend. A legend that has been handed down over 2 centuries. There are many versions and retellings of this story. This is simply one of those retellings. The Bell family moved from North Carolina to Adams, Tennessee during the United States migration to Kentucky and Tennessee in 1804. Tennessee was full of fertile land for diversified agriculture, and the land was ripe for cotton farming. The family patriarch, John Bell, had purchased a large swath of land, along with a magnificent house for his family, consisting of his wife, Lucy Bell, and their 5 children. After moving to Tennessee, the Bells had 3 more children, and the family of 10 managed to do well for themselves, eventually purchasing over 300 more acres of land and clearing many fields for planting crops. But all wasn't happy with the Bell family. Despite being well-known and fairly well-respected, they acquired their land in less than savory ways, and it was said that John Bell wasn't the kindest of men. A neighbor of the Bell family, Frederick Batts, was seriously injured during a farming accident, leaving him disabled. Being the sole provider for his family, Frederick was under pressure to support his wife and children. In order to stay afloat, the Batts family were forced to sell parts of their property off to neighbors. Much of their property was purchased by John Bell for a pittance due to the Batts' desperation for money. Frederick's wife Kate learned of the transaction with John Bell and became furious, believing that Bell had purposely ripped them off and had taken advantage of their bad position. Shortly after purchasing the land from Batts' family, John Bell made the decision to purchase a slave to work his farmland. John Bell purchased a young girl from a relative of the Batts family, but decided it would be best to let the young girl he purchased stay with her mother until she reached a working age. Years down the line, John Bell went to collect the young girl, who was now able to work, but was told by the seller he wanted more money now that she was older. Bell refused and took the girl regardless, spawning even more hatred of the Bell family from the Batts family. Kate Batts even swore she would make the Bell family pay. Not something you want to hear from a local woman who was frequently accused of practicing witchcraft. In 1817, John Bell was out tending to his land when he noticed something out of the corner of his eye. Upon further inspection, Bell found the strangest thing: an animal with the body of a dog and the head of a rabbit. Confused and scared, John fired his gun at the creature, only for it to vanish in front of his eyes. Later that evening, it was said that the Bell family heard loud thumping sounds on the exterior of their cabin for the first time. But it certainly wouldn't be the last. The sounds would only increase with time, getting louder, more frequent, and more alarming for the family. Each time the noises were heard, the men of the Bell family would rush outside, armed to the teeth, desperate to capture whoever or whatever was terrorizing them at night. But each time they left the house, the sounds would stop. The night would be quiet, and they would find nothing. And the terror would only grow. It wasn't long before the Bell children were frightened to even sleep, claiming that their blankets would be pulled from them, pillows would be tossed clear across the room, and that rats were gnawing through their bedposts. The Bell family was scared, but their fear would be nothing compared to what their youngest daughter, Betsy Bell, would experience. As the severity of the hauntings grew worse, it became more and more targeted at Betsy and the younger Bell children. The encounters the young girl had with the entity were not only frightening, but became violent and brutal. Betsy's hair would be pulled and her face would be slapped. She would frequently have welts, handprints, and bruises all over her body. It was claimed that one evening, Betsy awoke with her hair tied to her bedpost, unable to move, and was then barraged by what she could only describe as a force. Later, Betsy experienced seeing a young girl hanging by her hands from a tree as she walked past. After looking away for a split second, the girl disappeared entirely. The experiences eventually became too much for the family to handle, and John Bell finally confided the happenings to his good friend James Johnston. Johnston and his wife decided to spend the night with the Bell family to try and experience the haunting firsthand. The night they stayed, they were subjected to the same experiences that the Bell family had been having. Their bed covers were removed, and the husband and wife had been slapped repeatedly by an entity. Johnston eventually called out to the spirit, asking who it was that was haunting the family. Johnston claimed he heard a disembodied voice say Kate, which obviously led the family to believe that Kate Batts, who had already been accused of witchcraft, was somehow involved. Word of the haunting spread like wildfire, and eventually reached then Major General Andrew Jackson, who would go on to become the 7th President of the United States. Always a fan of the weird, Jackson demanded to visit the Bell farm to see if he would be able to experience the entity for himself. Jackson planned a trip, bringing along several of his men in a horse-drawn wagon, and was mysteriously stopped as they approached the Bell farm. The wagon simply would not move, regardless of the horse's attempts at pulling it. Jackson yelled in frustration, "By the eternal, boys, that must be the Bell Witch." In response to his cry, a voice spoke to him and the wagon began to move again. The Bell Witch had seemingly let the general and his men through. Upon arrival into the home, one of Jackson's men claimed himself a witch tamer. The man flaunted his pistol, which carried a single silver bullet, and threatened death on any entity that may appear to him. The Bell Witch, which the family was now calling Kate, was none amused and began tossing the man around the home like a rag doll, slapping and beating him before unceremoniously kicking him out of the door. The rest of Jackson's men were terrified by what they had seen and began begging Jackson to leave the property, unable to stay another moment. Jackson declined, and the men spent the night outside in their tent before they all packed up and left in a hurry the following morning. The hauntings and experiences continued for the Bell family, and it quickly began to take a toll on them. John and his wife Lucy's health began deteriorating. The youngest daughter, Betsy, fell in love with a young man from town and agreed to marry him, but spent much of her time hearing about the entity's disapproval of her engagement. Wherever Betsy and her love, Joshua Gardner, went, they were tormented by the entity. It wasn't long before Joshua could no longer take the constant fear and broke off his engagement to Betsy. Betsy's experiences with Kate the entity did begin to slow down after her engagement was ended, but John Bell was still a focus of the entity's anger. John's health continued to deteriorate. For a year, John experienced twitching and tingling in his face, and had difficulty swallowing due to his tongue swelling seemingly out of nowhere. By 1820, just 3 years after the haunting had started, John's health was in severe decline, and he was confined to the house where the entity attacked him relentlessly. It began with the entity trying to remove his shoes while he walked around the house, or slapping and attacking him while he seized on the floor. All the while, during the torture, the entity's voice would yell about old Jack Bell. During this time, the entity Kate was surprisingly nice to the rest of the family, caring for an ailing Lucy. Whether it was out of the entity's genuine concern or just wanting to get closer to the Bells to continue inflicting pain is something we may never know. On December 19, 1820, John Bell slipped into a coma and was pronounced dead the following morning. After his death, the Bell family were quick to find an unidentified bottle of liquid in the cabinet. It was said that the Kate entity had been heard claiming she gave old Jack a big dose of that last night, which fixed him. One of the older Bell children threw the vial into the family hearth and watched in horror as it burst into a bright blue flame and shot out of the chimney. After the funeral, Lucy, John's widow, was visited again by the entity, which told her it would return in 7 years. For 7 years, the Bell family lived in relative normalcy, but in 1828, the entity returned as it had promised so many years prior. For 3 weeks, the entity remained in the house, but this time seemed to have far different plans for the Bell family. There were no slapping incidents, no strange noises at night, and no strange creatures roaming around the farm as there had been before. Instead, the entity seemed to befriend the eldest Bell son. They would have discussions revolving around life, Christianity, and more. After the 3 weeks was up, the entity claimed it would return in 107 years to visit the closest living relative of John Bell. That year would have been 1935, and John Bell descendant Dr. Charles Bell claimed nothing, but did write a book titled Bell.Witch in 1934. The Bell farm today is a tourist attraction where you can visit the old family farm, as well as the cave nearby where the entity was said to have been based. The Bell Witch legend has also been the basis for many well-loved horror movies we know today. The movie An American Haunting was based on and even used the Bell Witch name. But perhaps the most notable movie based on the Bell Witch legend is the first of the found footage genre, The Blair Witch Project. What do you think happened on the Bell farm? Was there truly an entity tormenting the Bells? Was Kate Batts a witch out for vengeance? Was it all hallucinations due to Kate Batts getting her revenge in more secular ways like poisoning and simple harassment? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. I would love to hear them. If you enjoyed this episode of A Brief History, don't forget to like and subscribe and check out the rest of the Brief History playlist. Thank you so much to my patrons who support this series. Stay safe, and I'll see you next time.